In the previous lesson, we introduced the purpose of this course. We learned that effective decision-making is not about predicting the future perfectly or guaranteeing that every choice will produce a positive outcome. Instead, it involves using a thoughtful process to understand a situation, compare possible actions, evaluate consequences, and select an appropriate direction. That introduction leads us to a fundamental question. What exactly is decision-making? That is the focus of this lesson. What decision-making really means. Decision-making is the intentional process of selecting a course of action from two or more possible alternatives. It begins when you recognize that a choice is required. You then clarify what must be decided, consider what you want to achieve, identify realistic alternatives, evaluate relevant information, and select what you believe is the most appropriate action. In some situations, the process is quick. You may decide which task to complete first, what route to take, or whether to accept a meeting invitation. In other situations, the process may require research, consultation, risk analysis, and careful reflection. The size of the process changes, but the central idea remains the same. A decision directs action. The basic elements of a decision. Most decisions contain several basic elements. First, there is a decision situation. Something requires attention or direction. Second, there is a decision maker. This may be one person, a family, a team, or an organization. Third, there is an objective. The decision maker wants to achieve, protect, improve, prevent, or change something. Fourth, there are alternatives. More than one possible action exists. Fifth, there are criteria or considerations. These are the factors used to compare the alternatives. Sixth, there are constraints. Time, money, information, rules, ability, and available resources may limit what is possible. Finally, there are consequences. Each alternative may produce different immediate and long-term effects. A selected action is the result of considering these elements, either carefully or automatically. Decision-making is more than having a preference. A preference tells you what you like. A decision determines what you will do. You may prefer one option but choose another because it better supports your goals or fits your circumstances. For example, you may prefer the most attractive product but select a less attractive one because it is more reliable. You may prefer to continue resting but decide to complete an important responsibility. You may prefer to avoid an uncomfortable conversation but decide that addressing the issue is necessary. Preferences influence decisions, but they do not make the decision by themselves. Decision-making requires you to connect what you want with what is possible, responsible, and useful. A practical example. Omar at the community garden. Omar Haddad has recently received a small plot in a community garden. He has never managed a garden before, but he is enthusiastic about producing some of his own food. At first, Omar thinks the decision is simple. He enjoys eating tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, peppers, mint, and rosemary. Therefore, he plans to grow all of them. His initial approach is based almost entirely on preference. He asks himself, which foods do I like? That is a useful question, but it is not enough. Omar's plot has limited space. It receives only a few hours of direct sunlight each day. The community garden also has restrictions on water use during dry periods. Omar works full-time and can usually visit the garden only twice each week. The plants he is considering have different sunlight, water, space, and maintenance requirements. They also take different amounts of time to grow. Some may produce a large harvest that Omar will use regularly. Others may require more effort than the results justify. The decision is no longer simply about choosing favorite vegetables. Omar's initial approach. Omar initially assumes that planting as many varieties as possible will produce the best experience. He believes that more choices will create more value. However, trying to grow everything may create several problems. Some plants may compete for limited space. Some may not receive enough sunlight. Others may require watering or maintenance that Omar cannot provide consistently. A large number of varieties may also make it more difficult for a beginner to understand what is working and what is not. Omar's enthusiasm is valuable, but enthusiasm alone does not create an effective decision. Why the decision is more complex than it appears. Before selecting what to plant, Omar needs to clarify what he wants the garden to achieve. Does he mainly want to produce food that he will use regularly? Does he want to learn basic gardening skills? Does he want the garden to require as little maintenance as possible? Is conserving water especially important? Does he want a large harvest? Or would he be satisfied with a smaller and more enjoyable learning experience? These objectives could lead to different choices. Omar also needs to identify his constraints. He cannot increase the amount of sunlight. He has limited control over the water supply. He cannot visit the plot every day. He must work within the actual size of the space. These constraints do not make the decision impossible. They help define which alternatives are realistic. A more effective decision-making approach. A more effective process would begin with a clear decision statement. How should Omar use his limited garden plot to produce useful food while keeping water use and maintenance manageable? This statement is more helpful than simply asking which plants he likes. Omar can then establish a few important criteria: suitability for limited sunlight, reasonable water requirements, manageable maintenance, efficient use of space, likelihood that he will use the harvest, appropriateness for a beginner. He can compare each possible plant against these criteria. He may discover that some preferred plants do not fit the conditions well. He may also find that herbs he uses regularly could provide more value than vegetables that require greater space and care. The purpose is not to identify one universally correct garden plan. The purpose is to show that a decision becomes clearer when the objective, alternatives, criteria, and constraints are made visible. Decision-making in a different context. The same structure can appear in a very different situation. Imagine a camper choosing meals for a short trip with limited cooking equipment. The camper may prefer several elaborate dishes. However, the decision must also consider food storage, preparation time, equipment, weight, nutrition, and available space. Personal preference still matters, but it must be evaluated together with practical conditions. This is the basic nature of decision-making, connecting objectives and preferences with available alternatives and real constraints. Common misunderstandings about decision-making. Misunderstanding 1. Decision-making begins only when alternatives are written down. Many decisions happen before a formal list is created. However, writing alternatives down can make hidden assumptions and overlooked options easier to recognize. Misunderstanding 2. Following a habit means no decision has occurred. Habit reduces conscious effort, but continuing to follow a habit can still represent an automatic choice. The important question is whether the habit still supports your current goals. Misunderstanding 3. Postponing a choice is neutral. Delay may sometimes be appropriate. However, postponing can also reduce available alternatives, increase costs, transfer control to someone else, or allow circumstances to determine the outcome. Non-action can have consequences just like action. Misunderstanding 4. A decision and its outcome are the same. The decision is the selected course of action. The outcome is what happens afterward. The outcome may be influenced by the decision, but also by uncertainty, other people, changing conditions, and chance. Misunderstanding 5. Every decision requires complex analysis. Routine and low-impact choices usually do not require detailed frameworks. The amount of analysis should match the importance, uncertainty, risk, and reversibility of the decision. Misunderstanding 6. More alternatives always improve the decision. Additional alternatives can be helpful, especially when the original options are limited. However, too many similar or unrealistic alternatives can create confusion. The objective is to identify a manageable set of meaningful choices. Practical activity. Analyze 5 recent decisions. Think about 5 decisions you have made recently. They may come from your professional or personal life. For each one, write down what was being decided, what alternatives were available, what option did you select, what outcome followed. Was your choice intentional or mostly automatic? Pay particular attention to the difference between the choice and the outcome. For example, selecting an option is the decision. Whether it later succeeds, fails, or produces an unexpected result is the outcome. This activity will help you recognize how frequently you make decisions and how much structure you currently bring to them. Lesson summary. In this lesson, we define decision-making as the intentional process of selecting a course of action from 2 or more possible alternatives. A decision usually contains an objective, alternatives, criteria, constraints, consequences, and a selected action. Through Omar's community garden, we saw that a choice that initially appears simple may involve several competing goals and practical limitations. Omar's preferences matter, but they must be considered together with sunlight, water, space, maintenance, and the purpose of the garden. Decision-making helps transform a general desire into a practical direction. 3 practical takeaways. A decision connects an objective with a selected course of action. Preferences are important, but they must be evaluated alongside alternatives, constraints, and consequences. The decision itself should be distinguished from the outcome that follows. Reflective question. Which recent decision did you treat as simple, even though it contains several hidden goals, alternatives, or constraints? Practical action step. Select one decision you currently face and write one sentence that clearly states what you are deciding, what you want to achieve, and the main constraint you must respect. Now that we understand what decision-making means, the next step is to examine why this ability has such a significant influence on our results, relationships, opportunities, and future direction. In the next lesson, we will explore why decision-making skills matter.